Cores, the pull of remembering back to the center of time, back to the center, over and through and back by way of the middle again. Spiritual pathways, a promise delivered, a navel formed by the crisscrossing lines tracing the adventures, the joys, the frights, highlighting the heart, emphasizing the soul, memorializing the memory itself, tracing the adventures, the joys, the frights, the hopes, the fears, the lines of the stars, passages, ribbons, spiritual pathways, land constellations, a promise delivered, ribbons becoming bows, markings of sacred journeys traced over and over and over again. Corridors, our way of stitching back together that which in our utterly confused clumsiness we have torn all the way apart. Overstitch, understitch, cross-stitch, backstitch. A way to repair, to apologize, to do over, to extend our young hand in remorse. Backstitch, overstitch, understitch, cross-stitch. A heartfelt, prayerful way to repair, a hopeful way to repair, of threading back together, of coming back together, of stitching back together that which we realize has always been meant to live as one. Carnivores, paradoxical kin, the ones who with a single leap take the lives of those so very close to us in order to feed themselves, in order to feed their young. And also the guardians of life all around us, of our kin who eat plants, of the plant kin themselves, and even of the rich and fertile soil which births them. Keepers of balance, teachers of elegance. Puma, jaguar, panther, imposing reflections of our very own power, inviting us to retract, to fully retract our arms, to tread with the lightest of toes, keeping silence, holding reverence. A caress for the land with each step, a caress for the land with each purr. Puma, jaguar, panther, imposing reflections of our very own power, inviting us to know the fullness of our most unabashed roar. When it's time to be known, when it's time to be present, when it's time to offer nothing but our most preciously primal protection.
The Emerging World Project Studios recognizes that we occupy land in Los Angeles County originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Quiche, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of the lands and waters in Los Angeles County.
Welcome. This is the Emerging World Project podcast. What are you doing here? I'm Addison Brown. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to an exceptional guest who has dedicated her life to making a positive impact on our planet, Beth Pratt. Beth is an acclaimed author, conservationist, and advocate. She is a true force of nature, channeling her passion for wildlife and the environment into transformative action. As the California Regional Executive Director for the National Wildlife Federation, she has led groundbreaking initiatives and tirelessly championed the cause of conservation. Her relentless commitment to protecting our natural world has earned her well-deserved recognition and respect among her peers. Beyond her impressive role at the National Wildlife Federation, Beth is an accomplished author who has captured hearts and minds through her writing. Her work not only educates and inspires readers, but also shines a light on the urgent need to preserve and restore our fragile ecosystems. From the pages of her books, she paints vivid pictures of our natural wonders, urging us to embrace a sense of stewardship and forge a harmonious relationship with the earth. Beth Pratt's advocacy extends far beyond the written word. Through her engaging presentations and impassioned speeches, she sparks a deep sense of connection between people and nature. Her ability to communicate complex environmental issues in a relatable and accessible manner has empowered countless individuals to join the fight for a sustainable future. In today's conversation, we'll have the privilege of delving into Beth's remarkable journey. We'll explore the formative experiences that awakened her love for wildlife, delve into the challenges facing our planet, and discover the innovative solutions she champions. In this time when the need for environmental stewardship has never been more pressing, Beth's work serves as a beacon of hope and inspiration. Through her writing, conservation efforts, and advocacy work, she continues to galvanize individuals to take action, reminding us all of our responsibility to safeguard the planet for future generations. Brace yourself for a thought-provoking discussion as we explore Beth Pratt's vision for a world where nature thrives and humanity and wildlife coexist in harmony. There she is.
Hello.
Why, hello there.
How are you doing?
I am doing rather lovely today. Yeah, I love a slow start, and that's what I got today. So,
Oh, good. Awesome. I'm glad.
right? They come
Mhm.
few and far between. How about you?
I'm good. Yeah. Back today after about 10 days on the East Coast for work. So catching up a little bit, but it's good.
So, I just want to start off by thanking you for taking the time out of your schedule. And I also want to thank you for being so generous with your time. I've watched a lot of interviews with you and read a lot of stuff. And one of the things that I really appreciate is somebody with your expertise and uh, commitment also has the commitment to giving that information out to other people that may not be able to receive it so easily. So thank you
Oh,
for that.
well, thanks. Yeah. No, it's a labor of love. So thank you.
Right? Right?
Mhm.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, so I want to start off by asking you, what would you say is your earliest memory of your relationship or knowing that you had a relationship to the natural world? And where does that memory take you?
Whew, earliest memory. Boy, I'd have to go back to actually two for sort of my earliest memory with the natural world. And I actually remember this. It surprises me that I was this young, but my mother confirms it. But I remember wanting to be outside and sneaking out of my bedroom window one summer. This was outside of Boston, where we grew up in the suburbs, because I wanted to walk around the backyard and I think look for frogs. We didn't have a lot of wildlife growing up in the suburbs of Massachusetts, or I should say big wildlife. We didn't have back then coyotes or bobcats, deer, even raccoons. I don't think we ever saw one. What's great, if you go back to my neighborhood now, all of that is there. But at this point in the early 70s, it had been banished, and we had frogs and turtles and birds and squirrels, but that was about it. And I just remember wanting to go walk around in people's backyards and look for things. And so I snuck out, and of course, terrified my mother once she found I was gone. But that's a pretty early memory about just that connection to the natural world.
It sounds like it was just very natural, right?
Yeah,
Like,
it's
yeah.
just like, I'm gonna go outside. I am
Right.
always happier outside. So yeah.
Right. No, I love that. I love that. I often feel that is um, the memory of our connection that we have to come back to. I think that
Yes.
those memories lie deeply
Mhm.
in humans, and a return to that is really what we're looking
Yeah.
for.
And it's hard. I can't really think of a time I didn't have a connection to animals.
Mm,
You always had
mm,
we always had pets growing up, but also my earliest memories of either TV or books like The Wind in the Willows. And I'm looking right
mm,
now in my office at Frog and Toad are Friends. I have
mhm, mhm.
a book that I read in childhood. So there was always just that connection to nature and animals. I mean, I just can't remember a time without it.
It's so beautiful, and it's beautiful that you've ended up using your life force to work in that area. And I hate to split it up like that, but unfortunately, it does feel that way, because even people that I've noticed that people that are born into situations where there is wildlife, large or small, have no connection, and you wonder, I don't want to say no connection, but no. Uh, Deliberate or intentional connection. And you wonder how that happens. And then you wonder about how people that are not in areas, and they are greatly influenced by their relationship to the natural world. So it's a complex understanding that I
Yeah.
often contemplate, which brings me around to my next question, and it has to do with spirituality. But I want to preface this with something that sparked my desire to have a talk with you, and that was, I live near the Hollywood Reservoir, and I spend a lot of time in Griffith Park and know the history and all the wonderful stuff about P-22. So I wasn't able to get to the live memorial, but I did watch the broadcast. And something that you said in passing, and it was very quick, you said that you recognize a more spiritual aspect to your relationships. And I just wanted to know if we could talk a little bit about that, because nature often inspires a deep sense of spirituality. And I guess my question is, how has your connection with nature influenced your own, let's say, spiritual journey?
Yeah, it is such an interesting question. Spiritual is actually a word I'm not entirely comfortable with, I think, but I don't know what
Mhm.
else to use.
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
not religious since second grade, when I grew up Catholic, and my CCD teacher told me the dinosaurs couldn't have existed, and I was like, okay, I'm out of
Mhm.
here. But
Ouch.
yeah, I was like, no. It just at some point became like, somebody who is a scientist and a student of science almost as far back as I can remember as well. That's been my guiding force. However, there is a spiritual, for lack of a better word, or soulful, or I don't know what word to use, part of me that recognizes there are, grand mysteries to this universe, and connections that are, I don't know, just energy and
Mm, mm,
things beyond, equations, I guess, for lack of a better word.
mhm,
There, and I think that has been my relationship with animals, and I've always tended to be on the more animal rightsy side of science, which of course science is now kind of, backing up what all of us who had animals our whole lives knew, which is they do have emotions and they do, have culture and language, and, and it seemed always very arrogant of us to assume that, we were on top. But anyway, back to your question, I don't know what to call it, but there is a connection with life that is beyond science, that for me, the natural world has always been there. And I think I will tell you a story about this campaign that might get it a little much, which is, obviously we're trying to build this world's largest wildlife crossing. And that's a very scientific conservation outcome. But to me, I've also seen as just as important as part of this work is connecting people with, we're connecting these landscapes for wildlife. But for me, connecting the psychological landscape for people to wildlife is also just as important. As you saw from the Celebration of Life, I mean, that is not your usual environmental lineup, right? That is a hip hop artist from Watts and muralist, and we had the first P22 day we had in 2016. We had this incredible group of students, second graders, come and read letters to P22. It's a school we work with a lot. They were actually a new class was at the Celebration of Life, and you get these kids, 100% school of color. I think 30% are undocumented, and especially during the last administration, they would go home not knowing if their parents had been deported. And when you think of that a second grader would have to face something like that, the challenges for me in second grade were a boy didn't like me or I got a bad grade. And nature and wildlife is what brought me psychological safety. It's what brought me that peace and contentment and joy. And it always has. And, I'd go to the woods and look at turtles if I was feeling bad. And one of the little boys read his letter. He's, again, second grade, and it was a longer letter, but he said, P22, I'm sorry you're sad and lonely. I know how you feel.
Oh my goodness.
And yeah, and we, we're standing there listening, and of course we all start bursting into tears. We have it on video. It's a great moment. And it dawned on me that was, that's when I realized this work is deeper than just the science, that it is about restoring that connection to the wild world that indigenous, people have had over time. And it's always been closer to my relationship with wildlife. And I'm not sure what the word is for it, if it's spiritual, but it is, I guess, just recognizing there is a connection there and something bigger than ourselves and something that is essential to us that we've lost, I think.
Right. I find this conversation often with scientists that I speak to, but I'm also recognizing something new that's emerging within humanity in how we approach our complexity, right? So maybe this will help. So I kind of started off in two different paths. I first started off on a monastic path. I was almost certain I was going to be a Tibetan Buddhist nun. And it got diverted, and I went into cooking. And I had always not wanted to eat animals, and I had no reason why. I didn't know why. It happened so young. It just came through. There was nobody around me that said you shouldn't eat them or anything. It was just a decision I'd made it as early as 4 or 5. So I embarked on this path, cooking, and that just ended up being a, kind of a clusterfuck, because everything that I really thought about the way the world worked sort of went down the tube, so to speak. But what this did was showed me the complexity in the way that we are connected and the way that we are imbricated in all of nature, right? And that is part of where my transformation happened. And I think that it feels as if people are on that pathway. The more I talk to scientists and I hear a little bit similar to the stories that you're telling, I'm starting to see that. And it really warms my heart, because it's going to require some new language for us. Right.
Exactly.
Not
You're
only
right. It's new language. I mean, I think that is such a good point. And I think P22 is such a good example of this new way of thinking. I mean, everything about him has been unprecedented, right? It's just been absolutely unprecedented that he was allowed to stay in Griffith Park, that people rallied around him in the second largest city. And even
Absolutely.
in his death, he just set new norms that you had, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife director, Chuck Bonham, who's a friend. He's a great guy, but you just, making an announcement in tears. I mean,
Right,
in some of the
right.
states that aren't quite as far along in the sort of compassion towards animals, I mean, he was criticized for that. We all were, for crying over a mountain
Mm.
lion. Yet that's the new way. I mean, we should be
Yeah.
approaching these decisions much more compassionately.
Agreed. And one could say that, part of our culture of suppressing emotions or denying emotions is part of this emergence, right? Is a reconnection with our own emotions as human beings and accepting those and finding more spaces where those emotions are accepted, whether you're a scientist or a psychologist or a monk or a nun or whatever, right? An athlete or any path you may go down, which brings me to talking about transformation and your own transformation, which I sense happened really early on. But I want to talk about a little bit your book, When Mountain Lions Are Neighbors. It explores the story, of course, of P22 in Los Angeles. Can you share with us some of the lessons that P22 stories uh, have emerged, and how can it inform our approach to what I'm saying is a new paradigm for wildlife conservation?
Yeah. Yeah, it really was transformational for me. I think on the path of wildlife, most of my career has been spent in national parks, both Yosemite, where I'm coming to you from my home, which is about 20 minutes from the Southwest Gate. I worked in Yellowstone. I've always been most of my,
Mm,
well, I still am, but park national parks are something that really captured my imagination as
mm,
a very young girl, and the idea that there were these places that were protected and wildlife could live in them. But it really was P22 that took me down that both scientific and social transformation that, wait a minute, these animals actually don't just need to be in national parks or these protected areas. And
mhm,
indeed, both
mhm,
scientific and socially, we need to rethink this because it's not working. When the number one threat to wildlife worldwide is the loss of habitat, we can't see these places as off limits. Yet that is such a psychological bias that
mm,
is so hard to overcome. I mean, even to this
mm,
day, we get criticized for, why would you build a wildlife crossing in a city? I mean, don't we don't want, wildlife shouldn't be there.
mm,
So it was a real personal transformation for me that, again, P22 really led. I remember having that moment in Griffith Park, like I read about in the book. Jeff Sikich has taken me out for the day. He's since become a really good friend. We both laugh about this moment, and he's showing me Griffith Park. I'd never been there. And I'm just, at first, was aghast, like,
mm,
wow, my God, he just doesn't belong. I mean, there's pony
mm,
rides and cyclists and golf. But then he's explaining to me all these challenges that
mm,
P22 faced and the other cats in the study. And I remember to this day having that real epiphany of, well, wait a minute, if he's got no other choice, then who am I to judge? I mean, this is
mm,
good enough for him. And then it led me down the road of learning more about the science of that. And indeed, that this whole, scientific notion that these islands of habitat, which I was taught, back in my 30 years ago in my, biology education, that, you put aside a national park and you keep the
mm,
people in one place
mhm,
and the animals in the other, that actually was wrong, that you needed connected landscapes. So it was a real epiphany. And to this day, it's for some, it's hard. I did a TEDx talk on this whole thing, and a good friend of mine who I've known for years, she's a scientist in Yosemite. She told me, she's like, oh my God, I listened to that, Beth, and it's everything
mm,
I've
mm,
worked against in my career. We try to keep the wildlife and people separate. And she's like, haven't you read studies that wildlife in cities are more stressed? And I said, well, I mean, who isn't? I'm more stressed in the city, but if it,
right,
if it means, they can't live, I mean, that to me is silly. So yeah,
right.
I think it's gotten a lot more acceptance. I just came back from DC, the International Urban Wildlife Conference, so I'm happy we're looking at this new both scientific paradigm of wildlife needs human spaces, but also
Beautiful.
this social tolerance, which I think people have spoken. I mean, I see such a transformation since I was a kid in how people look at wildlife and animals. Look at blackfish. Look at, I mean,
Right.
we really are reckoning with past mistakes in a way that to me is encouraging. I don't think we're quite there, but
Right.
we at least, I think, both scientifically are reckoning with it and also ethically, reckoning with, we need to look at wildlife differently and animals differently.
Right. And our place in the web. Somebody told me a story about some maps that she had witnessed, and she was doing some work with the Koji tribe, and they showed her these. I think it's a Koji tribe. I could probably
Mhm.
be incorrect, but anyway, they showed her these maps, and somebody that was part of that group that was from the North America said, "Oh, I, I, I really want these maps. I want to use these maps." And somebody in the tribe said, "These are not for you. So there's a place, like these are for the birds. This
Yeah.
is where birds go." So what I got from that story is this understanding that there is a place for us, and part of our as we sort of move into whatever we're moving into is recognizing our place in this web and offering ourselves restraint and understanding that that restraint is going to be for our benefit too, not only our survival, right? Because
Right.
there is the possibility that we too will go extinct with all of this, but that restraint will also offer to us that beauty, that wonder, and that comfort that most of us are looking for, that we find in when we're in nature. But
Yeah.
it there has to be restraint. We have to. There's I'm sure that you know this, because I don't know it. Again, I'll probably need to be corrected, but about those AV motorcycles that are
Yeah.
driven around in the desert, and how that dust goes north and covers the mountain, which causes the mountain snow to melt sooner, which causes the birds to come earlier, which disrupts the whole cycle. And then you look at that as recreation, human beings recreation.
Yeah, it's a really good point that I think, I was just in DC, as I said, giving a talk at the Urban Wildlife Conference, and I had a blissful few hours. I almost never have this, to
Mm-hmm.
walk around the Natural History Museum, and I hadn't been there since I was a kid. And they had a great exhibit on human impacts to wildlife
Mm-hmm.
and our natural world. And we assume it's a modern thing. It's not. I mean, I think indigenous people obviously had a different relationship, and in some respects, a more respectful relationship towards wildlife, but they had an impact too. You go
Mm-hmm.
back
Mm-hmm.
100,000 years, they had an impact on the environment. There's some theories they caused some mass extinctions of some species, and going back 100,000 years or so. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that it's something about the human race or species that I think sets us apart in not a good way, and that we seem to, since the beginning, have an inordinate impact on our environment. And I think that's something we need to reckon with, much like, and we're not. I think that's where, like, the evidence is all before us, yet we're
Mm.
still, business as usual. So I think there's something very human about this, impacting the natural world in a way other species don't, and thinking we are also immune from consequences. I mean, the pandemic
Mm-hmm.
was such a great example of
Mm-hmm.
us
Mm-hmm.
thinking we are immune from natural laws, right? And I just remember thinking, when folks wouldn't mask up, like, or even saying, I can't mask up, it's, I have a phobia or something. Well, that's true, and I'm sympathetic, but like, viruses don't care, right? I mean,
Right. Right.
and looking at, I guess, maybe as somebody who's a student of wildlife, and watching their resiliency and what they have to go through. And we could even deal with a lockdown, for
Mm-hmm.
6 months,
Mm-hmm.
where, you look at animals who lose their homes in a minute and somehow rebuild, right? There's a resiliency or a to the natural world, and a that we or an acknowledgement of natural laws that I think we just also try to ignore. And I think it's going
Mm-hmm.
to be our undoing. I mean, I'm not a doomsayer, but we are just marching forward. I mean, I was just on the East Coast with the smoke, I mean, and I live in
Mm-hmm.
California, and that smoke is now the summer season. I've had to evacuate 3 years in a row. We have,
Mm-hmm.
immense higher temperatures. I just read a report about the ocean temperature being about, the highest they've ever seen. Yet we just keep marching forward without changing. And I think that's where we kind of differ. Wildlife doesn't, I think, behave in a way that spells their own doom. you know?
Right, right.
Mhm.
So there is an over, I guess we could say, an over intellect in play
Yes,
with
maybe that's a
human
good way to
beings.
put it. Yeah.
So the other half of that, right? We could call it, I don't won't call it spirituality. We don't want to use that word today.
Oh, I mean, you can use it.
Just kidding.
There needs to be, there needs to be some. I got to come up with that word, but I'm not sure what it is.
I'm struggling, to be honest, I'm really
Yeah,
struggling with new language. I'm
yeah,
really aware of the need to recognize and create and listen to new language. So I do appreciate you
yeah.
saying there's the
Reverence is the
inability.
word that comes closest to me for my relationship with the natural world and wildlife, but it's not quite it either. I think when you say spirituality, people tend to
Uh,
then go down the road to religion a little bit.
right, right.
Yeah,
And yeah, and it's not, to me, it's not at all.
yeah,
That's like one of the tenets in Buddhism is like, well, this is not even a religion. So we
yeah.
could just, go from there. But let me not go down that
We could,
track.
yeah, we could. Yeah.
I want to go down a different a
Yep.
different rabbit hole here. Right, dystopia. Let's have a through-topia. Let's try that.
Okay.
So yeah, okay. So there are overdeveloped intellect seems to is what I sense and what I feel a lot. And the question is, how do we relate and how do we communicate and how do we get as much involved in other people's lives, so to speak, as wildlife conservationists with a new paradigm lurking around the corner if we want to survive, and let people know that it's really up to them to move into this new consciousness, this new understanding of how to live in the world.
Yeah, boy, that's a good question as to how to do that. I mean, I think there's sort of two tracks to that. And, I always like to stay with the first one, which is just about facilitating in a real
Mhm.
positive way connections to
Mhm.
wildlife. Or it's
Mhm.
not even facilitating. I think everybody has or most people have a relationship with wildlife. It's about empowering those connections and
Mhm.
recognizing those connections. And I think the worst thing science and conservation groups like my own did decades ago, which was, you know, can't anthropomorphize. You can't have a relationship
Mhm.
with wildlife.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
unscientific. Well, that has done more damage than anything I can think of. Of course, we need relationships with wildlife, and we need to recognize that, the worth of an animal is not on a scientific paper. They are beings. What did Henry Beston, who wrote The Outermost House about a year on Cape Cod in the 20s, is one of my favorite nature books. I'm going to butcher this quote, but they are fellow prisoners of the
Mm,
travails and the splendor of Earth,
mm.
and that's how I see wildlife. They are fellow
Yeah.
beings,
Yeah.
and so how do we get people to that place? Well, it ain't a scientific paper. Now, I'm saying that as a scientist. Science is important. Science
Right.
is how how we rigorously solve problems. We, like the wildlife crossing, we wouldn't know that these mountain lions um would have gone extinct if it wasn't for science. We wouldn't know how to build a wildlife crossing if it wasn't for, but despite reams of scientific papers, many wildlife species has gone extinct, and that's because that takes public will and caring. So I think
Right.
what I try to largely is, even with all my doom saying, is to approach it from a very positive standpoint, which is like the P22 celebration of life.
Mhm.
You recognize these connections and help empower them, and we have people who work to protect P22 and other wildlife who P22 was their first entry into the wildlife world. They had never supported an environmental cause before. So I think it is about, helping that imagination get to love is the first approach to my work. But when I have to, don't poke my bear. Sometimes we have to get into, policy and enforcement, because I think there is a subset of people who are just never going to get there that way.
Right.
So
Right.
that's where I think that, that the teeth to wildlife, whether it be enforcement or policy or whatever, is also there. But but to me, even the crossing, we knew that was going to be a long game, changing people's hearts and minds. And I think that's how we have to do it for conservation. It's not going to happen overnight, but we have to get at the imagination. My good friend Malcolm Margolin, who he was head of Heyday, he worked with him on When Mountain Lions Are Neighbors. He said something to me once, which has always stuck with me, despite how we opened this program about. He's like, the education system has never been one much to change minds. It's, and look at the age we're living in, where facts don't matter. It really is the heart and the imagination. And he said, religion's actually done a better job at getting people to change their behavior,
Right.
but I, substitute religion for imagination or love. And that always stuck with me. That's how you change minds. It's not.
I absolutely agree.
It's not the
I
facts.
absolutely agree.
You need the facts. You need those as a foundation. But if you're going to change people's behavior, if the facts are on your side, I should say, then yes, it's something much deeper than that.
I agree wholeheartedly. Imagination and curiosity. I know if I throw out, very specific questions that are going to charge the curiosity of another person, then I can see some movement. I can look in their eyes and I can actually see some movement there. And then there, like you said, there are other folks that, are only going to respond to legislation or, or maybe not signs, don't bring your dog, and they bring your dog anyway. But
Yeah,
we'll get to trails later. But
let's talk trails at some point. I would like to talk about that.
It is. We are a bit of a mixed bag as humans. I mean, and it must seem like when I want to stay optimistic about our survival, I think it is going to be about a tipping point, right? So we're at this tipping point towards annihilation, extinction, or then that maybe a tipping point in consciousness towards emerging into something we don't even know what that is. Okay, so because I know I wanted to talk about the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing from an innovative solution to mitigate the impact of urban development on wildlife, and I know that you are deeply involved in that project. So if you could share with me what that process has been like, what you envision, how that will shape the future of conservation efforts, and how is the wisdom of Indigenous peoples included in this project?
Yeah, boy, all good questions. I mean, it's been astounding. I'm still a bit dizzy and still a bit exhausted. It's been a long haul. I've been working on that since 2012. Others on our team for decades, like the National Park Service, they had, been doing the science and the research around that much longer. Same with the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, who had the, the foresight to preserve the land. We wouldn't have a crossing without it for, decades before. So, but yeah, it's an amazing time. I mean, I was told this in the news, I was told this in the public, that we were crazy. We were idiots for trying to do something like this. But, for me, it didn't matter. It was a moral imperative once I heard that this mountain lion population was going to go extinct. I look at the polar bears sometimes and feel helpless. I mean, if it was me, I would just toss them some salmon, but I don't have that power. But here was something we could do something about once, I found out what the problem was, and that, this is all that stands in the way, money to build a crossing. Well, heck, that's solvable. So I will, like any visionary, big, ambitious thing, it was not easy at all. It was challenging. There was a lot of desperate and tough moments over the past 12 years for me. But boy, here we are. And it is just so emotional to drive by that site and see the construction going up. And if you can't drive by it, you can go to 101wildlifecrossing.org and we have a live camera on it. So, but I think the lesson learned there, a couple things. One is, don't shy away from big things, especially if you're on the side of right? We had the science on our side.
Right on. Yes, absolutely.
My favorite movie about leadership, not just because Brad Pitt's in it, but Moneyball, which I think encapsulate what it takes to be a leader, which is, he stood firm on his vision. He wasn't even 100% sure it would pay off, yet despite being threatened with being fired, with the press lambasting him, with his own team, some of them quitting and doubting him, he kept going, at least to see it through. And I think that's what you kind of have to do, is just somebody needs to take, put the blinders on and be a champion. And I think that was my role, but it took a village. Every team member had their own role, and mine was also being willing to carry a cardboard cutout of P22 around and talk about his dating life, right? So
people can
um,
relate to that.
yeah, and what has been really, to me, encouraging is it's not just about the one crossing. I think what P22 and the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing have done is inspire more. It has really elevated the cause of connectivity and what it means for wildlife, and that these projects are possible. I mean, it was named, I'm still blown away by this. It was named one of the number 15 in the 50 most influential projects of
Beautiful.
2022, up there with the Human Genome Project and the James Webb Telescope. And
It's beautiful.
because it is, again, these things, wildlife crossings are nothing new, but to put them down in, one of the most urban areas in the world, it's going to be the largest because the 101 is, such a formidable freeway. So it's already inspiring others. I was just back east talking at the International Conference on Ecology and Transportation as well. Wallace Annenberg herself, who's just amazing. As we launched at the Celebration of Life, this new initiative I'm leading to raise 500 million to build more. And she put up the first 10. Governor Newsom and Secretary Crowfoot, I'm so fortunate to live in this state. They want to do more, right? And not only the philanthropists and the government, but the public is now very supportive of these projects. So I think, those all line up in a way that to me is really wonderful, because it's not going to be just about the one, it's going to be about more.
Right.
And into your last question about the indigenous knowledge, that to me, part of that, again, representing different views on wildlife, and what we work with one individual especially, but I've become good friends with, which is Alan Salazar. He's a Chumash storyteller, also has some other affiliations, and he was one of the people. There were many who led the private burial I was really honored to be invited to of P22. He was also at the Celebration of Life, but we invited him to one of our earliest design meetings. And I think that, what, indigenous knowledge brings is, a different voice to this. I think, like we talked about at the beginning, it's their relationship with animals, I think, is more akin to my own, and at least approaches on the spectrum what we should be getting back to, their relationship to the natural world, things like that. But I think, they also bring that connection to the word we can't figure out, spirituality, right?
Agreed.
The first design meeting we had, design workshop, it wasn't the first design meeting, but we did a design workshop in 2018, 2019, when Caltrans had gotten to 30% designed. And we invited all those voices, including Alan. And he stood up around the end of the workshop and told the story, which is of the Chumash, is one of their creation myths, of how they told about a rainbow bridge that extended from the Channel Islands to the Santa Monica Mountains. And that was the future of their people. They crossed the rainbow bridge to the mainland. And the whole room, which is filled with, scientists and transportation engineers and, all these people who are not really storytellers, was just silent. And one of these bridge engineers raised their hand and said, "Oh my God, we should make the concrete rainbow colored." And, it really hit me again that, unfortunately we were not able to do that, but, but, it's stuff like that, that connection in time, and how, again, in some respects, this is not just a problem of the modern age. I think it connects us all to a humanness that's in all of us, and that extends back 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 100,000 years. And I think, to me, that's really powerful. And one of the things I appreciate Alan and other indigenous leaders we work with bringing is that, that actually is more about connecting us together rather than, to the wildlife itself.
I agree. I've often talked to people about, where they think the separation happened. That seems to be the the word we're using, this separation that humans think that they're separate from nature. And of course, we could go to religion. That's a little too easy, but something else. And it feels like people are willing, I think I'm repeating myself, but it does feel like people are willing to talk about that. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to see a room full of scientists, listen to the wisdom of indigenous folks. And I use the word wisdom because this information, this knowledge often comes from something that they can't even explain, right? So we're trying to explain, I read this book and I did this and blah, blah, blah. And then they're receiving some information that's unexplainable, that has allowed life to exist in a certain way, much more harmonious than it does now in our extractive
Yeah, but I
mentality.
wonder, don't you see, this is where I land these days. I think, all cultures have things to teach us, especially indigenous, but I'd go back 100,000 years. I don't think, I think it's something human, no matter what culture. And I think it gets at numbers, right? I mean, you do look at indigenous cultures who did not listen to nature and, starved to death because, they overextended, right? You think of, you look at, so what, that's why, like, I think to find this solution, we have to both listen to different voices like indigenous, but also
Right.
respect this is a human thing. And I do think,
Right.
especially as numbers
Absolutely.
get higher, it's a power thing. There's something in us as humans that think, at some point in every culture, or if the wrong leadership takes over, thinks we can, I mean, I'm pointing to
Right.
our own society
Right.
too. So what is it, where we, at times in history, going back, even before modern religion, even before, where we just lose that connection, and then, get to that arrogance that we can control things, that has never worked out well. If you look at the history of humans back probably even further than 100,000 years, right? So
Right.
I think that we have to be honest with ourselves. There's something in us humans, no matter what
Absolutely.
culture, that gets us there.
Indeed, the crisis is in humanity, period.
Yes, the
To
crisis
me.
in humanity, and
Yep.
to romanticize that there was somehow a time
Mm,
when this wasn't
not true.
wasn't happening,
Yeah.
then it kind of lets us off the hook. It's
Right.
something. And I mean, I thought, God, as a young kid, I remember watching 2001 and not understanding it fully, but then of course coming back to it as an adult. And I think he nailed it right there. That first scene where they pick up the stick, and
Mm,
it's something in that control and power that not everybody has, but that is in, some of us. And when those people become leaders, and it steers us a little wrongly. So yeah, I don't know what the magic answer is, but I think for me, that's important to keep in mind if we're going to solve a solution, is that, it is in all of us. And
mhm,
so how do
mhm.
we recognize that, and, somehow look at a system that hasn't existed really, maybe pieces
Right.
of it, right? We could pull pieces
Right.
of it, but that idealized where we did not have that potential. I can't find context in history, human history for it.
Right. Right.
Dan
Give
Flores has a new book out about, almost this. I haven't read it yet, so I'm very interested in his theories, about that. I think he starts in North America with our relationship pre-European, and then gets into the European relationship of to the natural world and wildlife, and sort of trying to chart that. I'm very interested to see where he lands,
Yeah. Yeah. That
because
sounds
it is
fascinating.
intriguing to me. Like, what is it about us as humans that we've always thought has, made us invulnerable or sets us apart a little bit? I don't know. Yeah.
Why do we wanna kill ourselves? What is
Yeah,
going on?
I don't know. I really don't
Are you
know.
that unhappy?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I appreciate you, allowing us to go off a little scientific,
Yeah, no,
realm
no,
there.
I think about these things. I mean, I think about these things especially today because we are seeking answers. And
Mm-hmm.
I do think we have to be careful. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
again, I think we have to be careful to balance the science of these things with the more psychological aspects, for lack of a better
Mm-hmm.
word. I think
Mm-hmm.
we need to recognize it's not going to come from any one culture or individual.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, it is a new paradigm that we as humans have not figured out yet. And I think
Yeah.
that is what's important. Can we? Sure. But we haven't yet. So how do we get there? And I think it is being honest about or reckoning with what it means to be human. I really
Yeah.
do. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It really does. It feels like the number one thing is having the courage to look that way. And
Yep.
I see that happening a lot. Oh wow. This conversation has taken us down pathways that I could not have anticipated. And as a result, we are going to make this a 2-part interview with Beth Pratt. So I encourage you to come back for part 2 and also take heed to what Mark has to say next. Until then, be the light in the room. I'll see you on the flip side.
Thank you for tuning in to the Emerging World Project podcast. What are you doing here? We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoy creating it for you. If you found value in today's episode, we would love for you to take a moment to leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps others discover our show and join our community. So please don't be shy. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. We read every review and your input truly means the world to us. To find out more about what the Emerging World Project is up to, head on over to emergingworldproject.org.